but I thought I would start just in a more general, broader place, which is about his where he thinks that he and I agree and where he thinks that we disagree. Because Jonathan is someone for whom those points of disagreement are very significant to me, since I think highly of his views, and so I often think about kind of why it is that he may be reacting in a particular way and I might be reacting in another, given that I think we share a lot of values. And so I encourage you to put your own questions in the chat, some of which I will I'll articulate, but I also just want to make sure everyone recognizes that the chat should be respectful. You can offer vigorous criticisms of things that Jonathan or I have said, but please make sure that they're respectful in tone. So please, Jonathan, go ahead.
Thank you, Peter. And it's very good to be with all of you. And as you say, we have sort of known each other on and off for, I was realizing it was actually 25 years ago that you commissioned me when you were editing the New Republic to write about Ken Livingstone, who became mayor of London. That was a whole other story. Jessica in the chat mentioned that I should say that I do also co-present a podcast called Unholy. Two Jews on the News with Yonit Levy, who anchors Channel 12 News in Israel. It's relevant actually because you know, that interplay between the diaspora perspective and the Israel perspective has become part of my professional life very much, and it's a bit, you know, that's a big part of how I've sort of been coming at these things. But no, the mutual respect is not just the usual sort of media backslapping; it's real. And I've read your very potent and very powerful book. In fact, I've read it twice because we've rescheduled, and so I had to mug up afresh. So let's just say where I agree with you, and it's a lot. I think it's you know, I think what you have done and said is what I aim for too, which is to say it is not just possible but necessary to grieve for the dead of October the 7th and to grieve for the dead in the 18 months since in Gaza, and to be able to do both. I think your plea that the dead of Gaza not be nameless and not be an amorphous mass is morally sound and urgent. I think you're right that too many Jews cannot bear to look at that reality, that they deny it, they obfuscate it, they find refuge in arguments about numbers and stats, that they prefer narratives of victimhood. And I, you know, in my encounters with other Jews, I encounter that a lot, that there's a preference to talk about that rather than this current reality. I think you make fascinating points about our liturgy and the festival of Purim and Shavuot and so on. I agree with you that those sort of, you know, some of the fantasies or ideas we had about power of our place that are particularly expressed in the religion were maybe, you know, acceptable when we were powerless, but we are no longer powerless. And this is the biggest transformation in Jewish history, is the emergence from powerlessness to power. And we're not handling that very well. I completely would agree with that. That you know, just because maybe these things need stating, the occupation is cruel and indefensible. My first political intervention when I was 18 years old was organizing in my Jewish Zionist youth movement a campaign to write letters to those young Israeli conscripts our age who were refusing to serve in the West Bank. I was 18, you know, so this is a consistent position. I am, in fact, the same age as the occupation. I was born in 1967. So all of that, finally, that the destruction of Gaza changes what it is to be Jewish and will do for many generations. I agree with you. And you know, to quote Thomas Jefferson, I sort of tremble when I think what this will do to Jewish identity in the coming generations. I think one of the most shaking days of the whole period was the day in January of 2024 when the International Court of Justice said there was at least a case to answer about genocide, because I then imagined that we as a people who have had a kind of moral authority as the victims of genocide to move in the world as a Jew when you are accused of that crime rather than being the historic victims of that crime is to be a radical transformation. So I'm not like some of your critics, Peter. I agree with all of that. Where I disagree is I think sometimes you assume that to hold all those positions
Mm, mm,
necessarily, logically,
mm,
must lead you to reject more than I think you need to reject. I think it leads you to say the opposite of all that
mm,
has to be a world beyond and without statehood. You often, I notice, counterpoint Jewish statehood with Jewish, or not counterpoint, equate Jewish statehood and Jewish supremacy, as
yes.
if one necessarily entails the other.
Mm,
I don't believe that.
mm,
I agree that right now, an occupation as old as I am
mm,
manifests that.
mm,
But I believe there is still at least a logical possibility you could have a Jewish Commonwealth where Jews have simultaneously self-determination and equality for its citizens. It's there in the Declaration of Independence, and I don't believe it's logically impossible. And I don't want to preempt our interesting conversation about being British and Jewish,
yes,
but I
yes,
have wondered if
yes.
part of our difference is that
Mm,
I sit here in a country that
mm,
defines itself as Christian.
mhm,
Its
mhm,
institutions are Christian. There
mhm,
is an established church,
mm,
the Church of England.
mhm,
The head of state in this country can only ever be a Protestant.
right.
That position is barred to me, in which the presidency of the United States is not barred to you. And yet, I would not describe this as a Christian supremacist country.
Mm,
Somehow, in a very British way, a fudge has been possible where you can simultaneously have Christian identity, but very loose and very open and so on. And there's room for minorities
mm,
to have full equality. And
yeah.
I don't believe that is beyond a Jewish Commonwealth. You could have a Jewish state that is simultaneously a state of the Jewish people and of all its citizens.
Mm.
And I'm not ready yet to give up on that goal, which I think, you have done. Um, and I could unpack that much more, but I've probably said enough.
No, no, this is perfect. I'm so glad that you framed it in that way, because I think you really did cut to the heart of the really fundamental disagreement, and very succinctly. And so I guess my question in response would be to kind of flesh it out a little bit. What would a Jewish state that was not a Jewish supremacist state look like for you? And do you think Israel has ever gotten close to that since its founding in 1948? Has there ever been a moment where you thought that was within reach?
Well, that's a great question. I think the Declaration of Independence is an outstanding start because it
Mm-hmm.
commits itself to this vision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's I once made a documentary about how that document was sort of cobbled together, and maybe a lot of it was accidental, but the language is there now, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a founding document. I remember some of the discussions around in the 1990s,
Mm-hmm.
where simultaneously you had a peace process going on, the Oslo process,
Mm-hmm.
flawed as it was,
Mm-hmm.
and you were beginning, there were sort of cracks in the permafrost. There were discussions going on. I remember, for example, writing a long essay in the Jewish Quarterly publication,
Mm-hmm.
talking about now that we are about to, it seems, undo the wrongs of the post-67 period, because it seemed as if a Palestinian state was going to emerge.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote that now we need to turn to the work left over from 1948. And part of that would be a reckoning with 1948, an honest admission of what had happened. And the new historians had already done that.
Mm-hmm.
But also it would mean, for example, and I remember a piece appearing in Haaretz talking about we now need to have the confidence to, for example, name all the villages bilingually,
Mm-hmm.
so that Lod is both Lida and Lod, and that the country could cope with that.
Mm-hmm.
That you would have the various, kibbutzim in the country, the Arabic name of the village which preceded those village kibbutzim could be remembered and restored. And this piece was calling for a kind of memorial commission to go around renaming the 400 villages and so on. I think you could imagine, in a way, you do have citizenship for Israel's Palestinian minority. The other day, I think you were making the point that they are people of whom Israeli Jews are not frightened,
Mm-hmm.
that they live alongside, that they put themselves in their medical care. That to me is showing you what is possible.
Mm-hmm.
I would nevertheless, and I don't deny that it would be some kind of balancing act, would still want this to be a place to which the rest of the Jewish people were connected. And I remember you and I think corresponded with when you were moving to the position you're now in, where I also wanted to sort of explore it and said, to me, it would still be important that in a situation where Jews faced a mortal threat,
yes,
analogous to the 1930s, 1940s, that Israel would still exist as a refuge. And at that point, your vision of binationalism could not guarantee that. To me, that's a red line. It would need to do that. And I think the thing emotionally that your argument does not account for is that deeply felt need for a refuge. And I think some people who hold your view imagine that was a fleeting historical need of the 1940s. Whereas, and again, perhaps this is about coming from a place where Jews are such a small minority, and in Europe, our feeling here is it's fleeting and transient and contingent to think that Jews don't need that. Like maybe now it's okay for a brief period, but if you take the long view of the last 2,000 years, the likelihood is such a moment, it could well come upon us again. And the lesson of our past is that you need to be prepared for that. And I just heard you on a podcast with Chris Hayes in which you said, you know, Jewish sovereignty, our tradition teaches us that Jewish sovereignty ends in tears. To which I would say our history teaches us that the lack of Jewish sovereignty ends in an ocean of tears.